Hi, this is Janet Fitch, and it is noon on Wednesday Pacific, um, 3 p.m. Eastern, and whatever time zone you're living in. And this is Writing Wednesday, where I answer your writing questions, your craft questions, your plot questions, your existential questions, writing life, psychological corners you find yourself in, all of the different things that writers worry about, because this is our tool and our office and our, what goes on in your brain is what, you have to work with. And so all the psychological aspects and, even business aspects. Um, it's if you have questions today as we go along, put them in the chat and I will be happy to answer them. And if you have questions in between Wednesdays, which is most of the time, uh, you can send me your questions at through my website, janetfitchwrite.com, and I can design a Writing Wednesday around your question. So the more lead time I have, the more time I have to think about it. But most of this is just a conversation. So feel free to talk to me in the chat, and we'll have a conversation about the question. So welcome. Today I do have a question. Somebody, Demi, sent me her question through my website. And I thought we should talk about that today. Her question is how to introduce character backstory and world building without info dumping. So info dumping is where you just take all the exposition, everything you need the reader to know, and you just dump it out for them, all in one big indigestible mass. And this is it's such an intrinsic question to the process because we have to deal with it every day. How much are we going to tell, and how much are we going to unreel gradually as the action moves along? And I generally will try to have any kind of exposition unfurl along with the action, interior to the scene. So how do I decide what to put and what not to put is what does the reader need to understand the scene right in front of them. So this can be a question of character, how to introduce character backstory, also world building without info dumping. So say I wrote a historical novel, which needs some measure of backstory. The reader needs to know, if you don't know anything about the 100 Years' War and you've got a novel that's set during the 100 Years' War, you're going to need a little backstory. But I'd say, okay, my first tip would be to not, don't be a history book. Start with the character and then weave the history in small bite-sized chunks broken up by what the character's problem is. The character's problem is front and center, and then the history gets carefully parted out and sprinkled in as what the reader needs to know. In character, the same thing. You don't want to set up everything to begin with when the character walks on stage. That's not how fiction works. First, you have the character that's in there on stage, and then bits and pieces are fit in. If you look at Faulkner, say, Faulkner, the backstory of the Civil War and the um, failure of the Southern cause and all of the dark side of, of slavery, of feudal life, aristocracy versus the uh, up and coming middle class versus the rural poor, the grudges, and kind of the whole dark history. There's a reason they call it Southern Gothic. Um, he he's not going to write the history of the American South to inform you of what's going on. He's going to start with the difficulties of the characters and the mood of that world, the kind of crumbling Gothic quality that was a result of all of this, and the smoldering resentments and stuff. Um, like what's happening in the moment of the scene, and then the little tendrils that are informing it. Hi, Sarah. So Sarah says, I tend to think about how much my character would know or be thinking about at the time of their predicament. They also tend not to think about history as history if it's part of their lived past. Yeah. When the Saracens came through, 4 years ago and burnt you know, um, half of whatever they called it, the Holy Land, or when Rommel came through with his tanks, and this has happened. So stay close to the ground, stay close to the characters, uh, and then resist the temptation to bring your reader up to speed for more than, think about like a paragraph if you're going to do it at all. At the beginning, sometimes you have to bring people into the world. Having written historical fiction, the Russian books, let's see how I did this. I started in the future, a more present time and place, and then back in Russia, and then we moved back to Russia, and we are in a place, in a time. It's World War One, so we start with the personal and what's going on in a family, and then there are bits of the war that start coming in because, one son is at the front, and one guest comes in and he is still in uniform, and he can bring us a little bit of news. People want to know what's happening at the war. So we know there's a war, but you don't want to open it and say, it was in the you can't, it was in the middle of World War One, and people were edgy at the Makara household. But info dumping is like inserting part of a history book into your work. I had a student who wrote about the civil rights movement, a brilliant book called Freshwater Road, and how she set up Freedom Summer is we have a girl who is going to register voters. She's going down from Michigan, and she's going to register voters in the civil rights movement in the Freedom Summer. Now, she doesn't pull back and give you an enormous picture. She stays with that character, and then we get the bits and pieces of her nervousness, and then her meeting people from the organizing committee, and her first impressions of the South. She's never been. And then we go to the second chapter, and we are in a bar, and it's the bar owner has his own thing. It's her father. And we get the different people, and they start talking about Freedom Summer. So you can work in some of your world building or character, especially the world building aspect, you can bring that in with characters talking about it and having different opinion and arguing about it. And then you're getting character development and the information you think the reader needs to understand what's going on. In introducing character backstory, we are dealing with this constantly. How much to do an exposition, which is where we catch up on things. Dialogue is for conflict. Exposition is for filling us in. How much does the reader need to know about your character that's not going to be witnessed in live scene, in dialogue, in action? The character, say the character's backstory is that they were orphaned at 3 and they were raised in, by this uncle, that uncle, family, pillar and post, and they've lived like a lifetime and now they're 18. And, how are you going to work in all that backstory? Remember, the front story of your story is the story. What's happening now is your story. The rest is backstory. So without a front story, you have no reason to supply backstory, right? There's no reason for it. You have an orphan arrive in England from India during the Raj, and she's up in Yorkshire. They don't start with a long backstory of the kid. They start with, that's a secret garden. They start with the kid arriving and everything being different, and then working pieces of where she's been lightly. And then it unfolds more and more as things are added to that. One of the great backstory introductions that I've ever seen is you all know that Under the Volcano is one of my favorite books. And it begins with 2 secondary characters talking about the protagonist. So that's a very Shakespearean type of opening where you have underlings talking about the king or whatever's going on. And then, second scene or third scene, the king arrives or whoever is the subject of that underling interaction. So this has, 2 friends of the consul who's a horrible alcoholic. We're talking about him and his alcoholism. So we're getting character backstory, not really backstory, but character information. It's a setup. We're getting information about that character. And then when the character arrives, we see, oh, yeah, we get it because we've been set up for it by these 2 minor characters. But one of the things that I admired about this book is there's a line where he drops in Oaxaca was the saddest word. Somebody is talking about going to Oaxaca, and the consul thinks Oaxaca is the saddest word, and then nothing else, nothing more. So the reader is leaning forward to find out more about why Oaxaca is the saddest word, and the author doesn't give it to you. So this is another important point about info dumping and character backstory, world building, and so on, is that you want the reader to know more. And if when somebody tells you too much, notice that you don't want to know anymore. How are you? You're an acquaintance. Everybody who's participated in social life has made this gaffe where somebody has asked you, so how are you? And instead of just saying, oh, getting along, or yeah, it's not too bad, you start in to tell them what's going on. And unless they're a very close friend, after a few sentences, hi Wendy, after a few sentences, you notice that they are pulling back, they are bored, you get the glazed look over their face. They really did not, it was inappropriate for you to actually start telling them how you are and the intricacies of whatever level of current crap you're dealing with. They did not want to know that. It was a social function, how are you? Like, hi, not tell me about how horrible your husband is, or tell me about how frightened you are for your kid, or whatever. And you're giving them more information than they wanted. And that happens to readers too. I didn't need to know how a submarine was put together. I just needed to know that they're on a submarine, maybe one or two interesting facts that relate to how they're getting the food down for the meal and how stuffed everything is. And I did not need a schematic of the missile defense system on that submarine. So you have to be delicate and not overwhelm your brain with detail that doesn't have much to do with the movement of the scene. So what the reader needs to know, and watch out for what they don't need to know. Sometimes it's things that you are interested in and motivate you, but you don't need them in this scene. You just need a little. And the other thing about the dump that people forget is that you're feeding out information, feeding it out. You're in control of where and when and how much the reader needs to understand the scene in question. Sometimes writers kind of lose control of that, and they've read it in a big chunk because they read the history, or they've worked out every single bit of the character's backstory, so they just stick it in. And if you tend to do that, know that the next day you're going to go back and take out what that scene didn't need and maybe save that for another scene. If try to also characters in terms of character backstory. You want to always associate the memory with an action in the present. So if I'm sitting in a diner, my character is sitting in a diner, and I need them to reveal certain aspects of what's happened to them, I'll let something trigger it. Something comes on the jukebox, and they remember their senior prom in this town that they've always hated, and remember what happened. And then and then the waitress can say, "Hey, do you want a top on your coffee?" And you can take a top on your coffee and then go back. But always come back to the present. The present story is what's happening. So Sarah says, have you read A Gentleman in Moscow? Yes, I have. The prologue takes the form of a court report that establishes how the protagonist finds himself in a situation that opens the book. Yeah, you can do that in so many ways. A prologue, but it's not a history dump. Gentleman in Moscow is from the point of view of the new Soviet state and its disdain for a character like this. So it has a flavor to it. It has there's inherent conflict in it. I have a prologue in the first Russian Revolution book that starts in America, and that is definitely we get a look at who the character is. Um, but all we really learn about her, besides her attitude, was that she was from an intellectual family, that she is an exile from Soviet Russia, and that terrible stuff happened back then, and that she's a poet. And then when we go back, we start in that intellectual household that we've been set up for, and we get to see what that was like in reality. And then the reality of the war starts coming along. That is in details, guests who arrive. And when I wanted to work in historical detail, because events during the revolution move very fast and you have to keep the reader up to date what's going on. Um, I often use wall posters that were, that declared something or other, and then there'd be a crowd around. You'll see the mechanics of this now when you read the book. That you'll see the crowd gathering around, reading the wall poster or a news. They ran out of paper and money, so they just put the newspaper on the wall because people couldn't afford to buy them. And then people would read it and stand around and have a conversation about it. So everybody would be adding bits and pieces of things they knew or suspected. So I was able to stay in character because my character would be in a crowd and then have people talking about it. And it heightened also the tension because you knew that violence was going to ensue. Um, um, so but you have to find ways to do this that are natural and always weighing like a chef or something, or a chemist, weighing how much the reader can tolerate before their eyes start to roll back in their heads and they don't want to know anymore or can't absorb anymore. Um, with character backstory, you always want to relate it to the front story. Something reminds them of something. Um, if say easy character filling in backstory, um, there is a character, say at the beginning of, I think it's Light in August, one of the Faulkners, where this young man goes to see this spinster lady who's sitting in a chair that's obviously was her father's, who was the judge, and everything was about her father. And so we keep coming back to her father, the judge, did it this way, and her father, the judge, did it that way. So we don't have to have Faulkner telling us this woman's obsessed with her father, who was a big deal in the last generation. And, he shows it. He shows that crumbling house, and he shows that everything's still in place from her father, and her father wouldn't open the drapes, so she doesn't open the drapes. So we feel it and we get it fed out to us. And I think that's going to be the info dumping, the world building is both in sci-fi and fantasy, your world building all the time, but also historical, because even though you're building a world that actually had existed, the reader is a blank slate. You have to build that castle in their mind. You have to build that demonstration, and what the hell is it about? And you don't want it in an indigestible history book manner, because the reader will glaze over and just, I don't want a high school history lesson. I want to know about this girl who's going to go down to register uh, people for Freedom Summer. I don't want a lecture about Freedom Summer. That's the opposite of fiction. Fiction, you have to be so sneaky with fiction. Fiction is extremely sneaky. You have to figure out how you're going to get this stuff in and still keep the reader's attention. So you have to sneak it in. It's like my ex-mother-in-law used to sneak zucchini into everything that she cooked, and as if we wouldn't notice. But you sneak it in. You don't like, here's a bowl of zucchini. Yeah, that was interesting. Um, let's see. Info dumping, world building. Always look for action. If there's action, you can slip things in. And so watch out for any sentence that starts, there was this, there was this. But if you notice the, action verbs, that Clancy is doing something, and then, sees the paper and, oh, so-and-so is doing this again. Son of a bitch, blah, blah, blah. You get a lot of information in through the characters and their thoughts rather than the authorial info dumping. So you remember, so that's a big help, that, remembering to use the characters to introduce information. And as far as character backstory, have the first couple of chapters live before you start trying to explicate character backstory. And that's the way it usually will work. If you look at some of your favorite books, they'll start with a couple of live chapters and setting up the problem, and then something will click into a little bit of backstory. But try not to have like a backstory chapter. It just stops the book dead. Stops. Let's see how I dealt with the historical one. I'm gonna turn my back to you momentarily. Take a look at the because the landscape is full of information. But rather than saying everybody was hungry because we're in the middle of the Russian Revolution and people are standing in line, you have people standing in line, and you join the line to get your bread, the ration system, and you stand there for 6 hours in the cold, and really cold, waiting. And then information goes up and down the line, and people are grumbling, and people are complaining, and people are defending the system, and all kinds of different ways of doing it. For instance, there's we're in the middle of World War I when my book starts, and we can have people. My character goes to a political rally, and she sneaks. Her parents don't know. She goes to this political meeting, and people are arguing the various arguments pro and against revolution at this meeting. But she's also noticing the cute guy sitting a few benches over. So the character's always active in these scenes. We very rarely get a standalone. The best speaker was a small, fiery man with wild black hair and a pince-nez named Leon Trotsky. We don't say Leon Trotsky took the stage. How does she know? You experience that world. You don't just talk, the author doesn't get in front of the scene. If only he'd listened more. Where is it? They all had something to say, but I had waited for this one. What a speaker. And then a little touch of information. He'd been the leader of the Soviet in 1905 when there had been a revolution and had just returned from exile. But that's it. I am not going to go on and talk about Trotsky in exile and his ties with Lenin, blah, 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 blah. The character wouldn't know it. And the reader is trying to stay in the scene. The reader is staying in the body of the character. So I just go for that. Trotsky made us understand that this moment, and then I can do a little bit more of what Trotsky's argument had been. And I'd read a lot of history and I'd read Trotsky and all this stuff. But what is this 16-year-old girl? Oh, she's 17. What is the 17-year-old girl going to remember, think about, take in, um, you know, having, so you're always using your characters. And what I often do when I really had to work something in historical, that how in the world would my character know this? The newspapers are just propaganda by this point. Is she had a friend who was working in the Bolshevik, within the Bolshevik Party, and to have a more knowledgeable friend that she would go and ask favors because she was um, her she was a former person, also a poet, and so she had no way of knowing what was going on. So she'd go in to get either a favor from a friend or to find out what's going on. And then you have a more knowledgeable character who is saying, well, if I was you, I'd leave for a couple of weeks because this is going to be bad. Or if I was you, I'd, do this or get job doing this. Um, and you can slip in a little bit more of the what's going on politically that way. Well, happy Writing Wednesday, says Hope. Um, let's see, what other kind of problems are you guys having getting character backstory, say, or world building without choking your reader? If anybody's ever started a fire, in a fireplace and seen somebody like just take a phone book or something and throw it in some wad of paper or just throw it in there and it puts the fire out. You have to tear the pages out. And I actually have this in the Russian novel because people were burning their books. You can't just throw a book in. You have to tear the pages out and twist them and get a little negative and then put that in. So you feed that fire very gently or you're going to smother it. So Hope says it's hard to choose which details are the most important sometimes. Yeah. And sometimes you get halfway through and you realize, oh, I needed to set this up back then. So it's something you don't do all at once. Sometimes you have to go back and plant something because you're going to need it later. And then sometimes it's just using your character as the distributor of information or the lightning rod of information. Really helps you choose what's important because what's important for this scene, for the reader to understand this scene. Big dump of information generally smothers the scene. Yeah, Laura says, I have a character do things like hum along to a tune that happens to be popular at the time. So that's the world building. What were people listening to? What clothes were they wearing? What was fashionable? What did they yearn for that they didn't have the money for? That's, these are all that sensitive, being sensitive to the moment kind of things. And then occasionally I needed to actually catch people up of what's going on. And what I did with that, that's usually the beginning of a chapter we're often sometimes even parting out the um, part one, part two. We give a big jump, especially say in wartime. And then you have to say what's going on in, let's see if I can find an example off the top of my head. Um, there's say a movement in the Civil War, Russian Civil War, big moment. Sometimes I'll go to part two or part six and have a big jump, and then I can catch, I think there's a clear one that I can remember and find easily, talking about the Russian Civil War, um, where I can catch people up by making a big jump in time, having a new part, part four or part six, and then describe briefly what has happened in the meantime. So it's not so much, the next day, the next scene, but you can cut ahead 6 months and then say, in the last here's one. Okay, so this one, we have scenes about um, my character's working in an orphanage, and she's telling, fairy tales to the kids, made up horror stories to a bunch of little boys, and they just love it. And but big things have been happening in the country in a war. So what I can do is I have a new chapter, and then I'm talking about the Russian Civil War, 1919. So I stop. I have a scene with the little kids, and then I have a break, new chapter. Meanwhile, General Eugenich burst out from his position behind Lake Peipus on the border between Estonia and Russia. So this is the author. I just have to catch you up to where we are. Within the week, he had taken Luga 100 miles away. So we know we're in Petersburg, so 100 miles away. He led German Freikorps troops, etc., etc. We'd beaten the Germans back last winter, and here they were again. So we're getting back into my character's point of view pretty fast. Third sentence. I go from there's an authorial catching you up really quick to military maneuvers, and then we did this. So now I'm back in the character's head, and we'd beaten the Germans back last winter, and there they were again under the whites. But this year was different. So is this authorial or is this the character? We're very close here. The depopulated city, in the depopulated city, people were listless, depressed. There was no fervor of resistance as there had been against the Germans. No one flooded out to build trenches. No rallies were called, no speeches. Where was the government? So now that's the character. Where was the government? Where was Trotsky to inspire us? Zinoviev, Rykov. And then the next paragraph is the apartment. So we get the character's point of view is pushing up to the surface, taking over that exposition from the author, only in the Shpalernaya apartment, her apartment. And so we're back in the story, back in her life, back in the apartment. Only in the Shpalernaya apartment did excitement bubble like a forest spring. The aristocrats, this is talking about the German invasion of Russia during the Civil War. The aristocrats reacted as if they'd received a gilt-edged invitation to the Grand Duke's ball, delivered by footmen in livery. Oh, happy days. So the people she's living with in this apartment are aristocrats, and they are hoping the Germans will will invade. They hope the Germans will kick out the Bolsheviks and bring the Tsar back. Um, so we're back in her life, in her apartment. I give it like one paragraph to, and then even in that paragraph, the character's point of view takes over from the author, and we get her perspective on the German invasion. So it's never the author, not for long anyway, just a few sentences for the author to have a catch up, and then the character comes and takes over. So here's a posh radical. Hello. Do you think it's beneficial to develop a plot before the character's protagonist versus antagonist? Develop a plot before the characters. Everybody's different, I don't. I start with characters and push them and put the screws to them, and then the plot is what happens. But there are people who have a plot and they already know how it's going to play out. Um, Different ways of doing it, but I always start, my stuff is character driven, so the characters are the plot. The way the characters press on each other, the way the environment, the situation that they're in presses on the characters, and then what happens. And then the environment continues to press them in different ways, especially during the revolution or historical moment. Um, they're going to be pressured not only from character against character, but then the big environment presses on them as well. So, say in this contemporary environment, I might say a woman and her boyfriend are having their relationship, and they're pressing on each other. The boyfriend, say, is not trustworthy. The protagonist might be somebody who is has been trustworthy, but is starting to not be so sure of it. And then you have outside forces, say, um, political uh, problems impinge, or the housing situation, that their uh, rent is going up. And then you can have a little bit of thought about what's happening in the housing market and go back to the interpersonal problem. And then the pressure leads to a new situation, which leads to pressure from a different degree. And that's how the little engine of your story goes. Somebody wins, somebody loses, there's a conflict, and then the outcome becomes the new place for pressure to come in, and then there's the outcome, and then that turns the engine of the story. Uh, so I personally don't develop a plot before the characters. I develop the characters, and then what happens to them is the plot. Um, but especially in a mystery, you have to figure out the plot. Uh, you don't necessarily have to, but most mystery writers do know the plot. They know what's going to be happening. And then as they go along, they learn more about the characters and how the characters react. But what happens doesn't come out of character, generally speaking. The plot is the thing, whereas in the kind of fiction I write, the character is the thing, and plot comes out of character. So Sarah asks, in your historicals, how much of your plot direction do you think was research driven? How often did the actual timeline of the revolution drive the narrative over the fictional characters' conflicts? Well, so I used the timeline of the revolution. I fudge nothing. Anybody who reads those books, who knows about that historical time, I have heard nobody say that I got it wrong. No historian, nobody. Um, because, and that's, I was very fussy about that. It took a long time. Um, but I can pick what part of the history I want to incorporate. What part would my character know about? What part would my character be affected by? So there were many times that the plot direction was determined the by the history. Um, you know, the bombardment of Petersburg, the political uprising, the way the class structure was flipped on its head, the way it broke her family apart, different people having different political allegiances. Um, so it was part, the history was the background, the reason why certain things, she had to deal with certain things. But there were also her own things, you know, the people that she was attached to and things that she was, you know, had to react to in her own personal life as well as in historical. But the research didn't determine the plot. It was the environment that stimulated, impeded, channeled her growth and development and choices. Um, she's very, she had been an idealist and she made a lot of mistakes based on what she thought or hoped would happen, and then was surprised, really surprised by what actually was happening. And she learned to pay more attention to what was actually happening than what was going on in her head. It was very dangerous. So she really had to be awake and watching what's going on. Um, but I rarely read something in my research and said, "Oh, well, that I'm going to put that in my book." You know, it was more where following the character. And okay, now we're in April 1918. What's going on in the history? What's going on in the politics in April 1918? And how is my character dealing with that? There was a cholera epidemic. You know, how did that affect her? Um, you know, there was a you know, the war was still going on, you know, until 1918. How did that affect her? Um, so Posh Radical says, I think I understand what you're saying. I feel like I have these big plot ideas, but later realize I have to make a relatable character. How do you avoid a mirror character, meaning more than one character who has the same problem? Uh, I, or do you mean the opposite character? There's a book that I otherwise really liked, but it had a problem, what I call multiple protagonist problem, which it had a middle-aged, over-the-hill surfer who was going to surf the big waves of Northern California. Then it had a middle-aged, over-the-hill surf photographer who was going to go out with the middle-aged, over-the-hill surfer who was going to surf the big waves of Boulevard. And then there was a middle-aged, over-the-hill tribal chief, tribal sheriff who whose land they were going to trespass on to get to the big waves of the. So there were three characters who were basically the same character, and it was a real flaw of the book. They needed to have people who were different from one another. I mean, even though one of them's a surfer, one of them's a photographer, one of them's a sheriff, they all had the same problem. They were middle-aged, over-the-hill men who people were disregarding. So that was what that's a problem that people have. So Posh Radical says, I'm sorry I meant making every main character like yourself. Well, that's a really good question. I think everybody, or almost everybody in the novel, is an aspect of myself. You know, so if I took all of my rebellion and I made it one character, and I took all of my uh, rulesiness and gave that to another character, and I took all of my nihilism and gave that to another character, and then you put them in conflict with each other to see what will happen. You know, I think that I don't worry about that too much. You know, usually a main character is like the author in many important ways. But not, I mean, we are so complex as people. We are, and so full of contradiction that the main character is never all of ourselves. It's aspects of ourselves. Um, and to make every main character like yourself, I think, I mean, over a course of books, or do you mean within one book, everybody is the same? That's a problem, you know. But you take pieces of yourself and you give them to various characters, then you do justice to every single one of them. You know what it's like to be a coward, you know what it's like to be a brave person. Give the coward to one person and the brave to the other. Pull it apart and part out your characteristics. That's what most, I think that's, for me, that's what my fiction does, is it gives, like I have in the Russian books, there are three girls, and one of them is the scientist, and one of them is the radical. The scientist is sort of the good girl, rationalist. One of them is the radical intellectual, and one of them's romantic, the poet, the protagonist. And it's basically those are all pieces of myself that and but added but I add other people that I've known to them, and other that give them other traits, fictional character traits. So they're all, you know, amalgams of myself, other people, and fictional constructs all. And then they interact. And what happens to each under pressure? You know, the good girl scientist ends up as a really hard ass pragmatist and kind of soulless. The radical intellectual becomes a terrifying member of the Cheka, the secret police, and you won't remember this, so if you haven't read the books, I don't think I'm spoiling anything. And the poet, who's the romantic, she maintains some of her romance. She maintains her love of literature and poetry and her decision to become a poet, but she becomes much more pragmatic than she had ever been, because she's tested in ways and she's learned that her idealism has gotten in her way in dangerous ways. Um, so people change as a result of the pressure that has been put on them. You know, they change in their own ways. So people develop. So the info dumping is of character backstory. Always weave, you know, it's a thread, it's not the cloth. You know, weave it in, do just a few lines at a time, feed it in so you don't smother the fire. Like, don't throw the phone book into the fire because it'll smother it. All right. Well, we've done another Writing Wednesday. Hope you enjoyed it. And please send me your questions through my website, janetfitchwrites.com. I love the questions. It's very helpful to be able to think about something before I come in and do these impromptu things. And if you haven't subscribed, subscribe, and then that lets me know that you're enjoying it, and you'll never miss a Writing Wednesday. So we'll see you next week, and good writing.